What started as an uneventful subway ride for Connor Drake quickly became a moment that would make headlines around the world. Stay tuned to the end. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support inspires us to share these incredible stories. Connor Drake sat quietly on a scuffed plastic seat, his baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a simple hoodie concealing his unmistakable features. The rhythmic clatter of the Hudson Line train reverberated through the metallic carriage, blending with the murmur of tired commuters. For the first time in ages, Connor felt ordinary, just another passenger blending into the crowd. No cameras, no fans, no flashing lights. The air smelled faintly of metal, aged vinyl, and the lingering scent of fast food discarded under a seat nearby. Connor leaned back, his eyes half closed, letting the motion of the train soothe him. He hadn't felt this free in months. No directors barking orders, no premieres, no relentless press hounding his every move. For now, he was just a man, alone in a crowd. But the peace didn't last. The train screeched to a stop at Lexington Station, and a new group of passengers shuffled aboard. Among them was a wiry young man in a gray hoodie, the hood drawn tightly around his face. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the car with restless energy. Connor noticed him immediately. He'd seen this kind of jittery behavior before. Trouble brewing. Then the young man's gaze locked onto a new target. An older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, boarded the train slowly, clutching an oversized handbag to her chest. Her steps were deliberate, her worn shoes shuffling against the floor. As she glanced around the crowded car, her eyes carried a quiet plea for a seat, but no one moved. Connor tensed, his jaw tightening under the brim of his cap. He considered standing up to offer her his spot, but before he could act, the young man stepped forward. At first, Connor thought he might help her. Instead, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Move it, Granny," the young man snarled, blocking her path. The woman froze, startled by his venomous tone. Confused, she hesitated, then tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her again. "Didn't you hear me? I said move," he barked, giving her a light shove. She stumbled, gripping a metal pole for support. Gasps rippled through the car, but no one intervened. Connor's hands curled into fists beneath his hoodie, his instincts screaming at him to act. The young man chuckled, glancing around as if seeking applause. A few passengers offered nervous smiles. Others quickly looked away, burying themselves in their phones or staring at the window. "Look at this old bag," the man jeered, turning to the crowd. "Dragging her whole house in here. What's in there, huh? Bricks." The woman clutched her handbag tighter, her eyes fixed on the floor. She tried to inch past him again, but he stepped in her way, his grin widening. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. "I'm talking to you." This time, he shoved her harder. She stumbled into the pole, and her handbag fell to the floor with a heavy thud. Connor shot up from his seat instinctively, but stopped halfway, forcing himself to sit back down. His eyes locked on the scene, his heart pounding. Surely someone else would step in, one of the 20-odd passengers in the car. A young man? A parent? Anyone? No one moved. The elderly woman bent down, trembling as she tried to retrieve her bag. The young man snatched it from her hands and held it above his head, shaking it tauntingly. "Give that back," she cried, her voice breaking. "That's mine, please." "Oh, now you've got something to say," he sneered. "Too late, Granny." He laughed, holding the bag just out of her reach. Passengers began recording on their phones, their faces impassive. A few chuckled nervously. Others pretended not to notice. A man in a suit flipped his newspaper higher, shielding his face. Connor's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His pulse roared in his ears as his frustration mounted, not just at the young man, but at the silent crowd. How could they let this happen? The woman's frail hands trembled as she reached for her bag again, tears forming in her eyes. The young man yanked it back with a smug grin. Connor stood again, this time not stopping. Something inside him had snapped. The time for watching was over. Connor Drake's patience finally snapped. He had watched too long, hoping someone, anyone, would intervene. But the man with the newspaper kept his face hidden. The passengers with their phones stayed glued to their screens, and the others just stared in awkward silence. Connor wasn't angry with the young man or even the bystanders anymore. He was disgusted with himself for waiting, for expecting others to do the right thing when it was clear they wouldn't. This time, when he stood, he didn't sit back down. With slow, deliberate steps, Connor moved toward the young man. No one noticed him at first, too engrossed in the spectacle. The young man swung the elderly woman's handbag like a trophy, grinning as if he'd just won a prize. The old woman reached for it again, her voice trembling, but he shoved her away with his free hand. "That's enough," Connor said, his voice low but razor-sharp. The young man froze for a moment before spinning around, eyes narrowing at Connor. He tilted his head, sizing him up with a cocky smirk. "What'd you say, old man?" he sneered. "Who do you think you are?" Connor reached up and pulled his hoodie back just enough to reveal his face. Recognition flickered across the young man's expression, his grin faltering. "Give it back," Connor said, his tone calm but deadly. The car fell silent. The mood shifted instantly, like the drop before a storm. Passengers lowered their phones, their faces now filled with recognition and disbelief. The young man's bravado cracked. "You can't be serious," he muttered, trying to laugh it off. "I don't care who you are, bro. You ain't special." Connor stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Last chance," he said quietly, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Put it down." The young man hesitated, glancing around for support, but no one came to his defense. Even the man who had smirked earlier now avoided eye contact. The young man's confidence evaporated, leaving only unease in its wake. "All right, chill, man," he said, raising his hands as if surrendering. "It's just a joke, okay?" He crouched down, setting the handbag on the floor. "Here, take it." "Apologize," Connor said, his stance firm, his tone unrelenting. The young man frowned, looking for an escape. "Come on, man, I said I was kidding." Connor didn't flinch. "Apologize," he repeated, his voice like stone. The young man swallowed hard, his face twisting in frustration. He turned to the old woman, muttering, "Sorry." "Louder," Connor snapped, his eyes blazing. The young man flinched. "I said I'm sorry," he barked, throwing up his hands. Connor stepped even closer, his presence towering. "Now, get on the ground." The young man's face drained of color. He froze, his breathing quick and shallow. Connor didn't move, his stare unyielding. Slowly, the young man lowered himself to the floor, lying face down with his hands behind his head. A voice from the back of the car whispered, "Is that Connor Drake?" Connor didn't look away. "Call the police," he said to the passengers, his tone leaving no room for argument. No one moved at first. "I said, call them," Connor repeated, sharper this time. A few passengers scrambled for their phones. The old woman sat down heavily on a nearby seat, clutching her bag as tears welled in her eyes. She looked at Connor, her lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Connor gave her a small nod, his gaze still locked on the young man on the floor. The train doors slammed shut with a metallic clang, sealing the car off from the outside world. The train jolted forward, and the rhythmic rumble of its movement returned, filling the narrow space. Connor stood like a sentinel, his posture unyielding, his focus never breaking. The young man lay motionless on the cold, dirty floor, his breathing shallow and erratic. The car's mood was suffocating, the weight of unspoken tension pressing down on everyone. The same passengers who had laughed nervously earlier now sat in stunned silence. Some lowered their phones, ashamed. Others glanced around as if searching for an exit. The unspoken agreement to mind your own business had been shattered, and Connor stood at the center of it all, unflinching. "Don't even think about it," Connor said, his voice low but sharp as steel. The young man mumbled, "I ain't moving, man, I swear." "Good," Connor replied, his tone colder than ice. A woman sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Connor, the young man, and the elderly woman. She fumbled with her phone, as if considering whether to call someone, but then shoved it back into her bag and stared out the window instead. "Did someone call the police yet?" Connor asked, his voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. A man in a suit cleared his throat, finally speaking. "Yeah, I called," he muttered, still avoiding eye contact. "They said they're on their way." Connor gave him a single nod before turning his attention back to the young man. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the heavy silence as Connor stood guard. The weight of his presence kept everyone in line. No one dared to look away, and no one dared to intervene. Connor Drake raised his voice, breaking the heavy silence. I said. Did anyone call the police? At the far end of the train car, a man in a rumpled suit cleared his throat, still fiddling nervously with his phone. Yeah, I called, he mumbled without lifting his eyes. They said they're on the way. Connor nodded once, turning his attention back to the young man sprawled on the floor. His voice dropped to a low growl. You hear that? They're coming. You'd better start thinking real hard about what you're going to say when they get here. I didn't do anything, the young man snapped, his tone bitter and defensive. She dropped her bag. That's all. You're all overreacting. Connor crouched down slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He lowered himself until he was at eye level with the man, his piercing gaze unrelenting. Don't lie to me, Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw everything. Everyone here saw everything. The only thing you should be thinking about now is how to make this right. The young man didn't answer. His eyes darted around the car, searching for sympathy, for anyone willing to come to his defense. But there was nothing. The passengers who had chuckled earlier now stared at the floor, their phones, or out the windows, anywhere but at him. Connor stayed crouched for a moment longer, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood back up, his gaze never wavering from the young man. The silence in the car grew heavier. The rhythmic rumble of the train on the tracks was the only sound, and even that seemed muted. Minutes stretched out like hours. Connor's presence alone kept everyone in line. Finally, the intercom crackled to life. Next stop, Springdale Station. Please stand clear of the doors. Connor glanced toward the elderly woman. Her eyes met his for the first time since the ordeal began. She dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her hands still trembling. Connor gave her a short nod. For the first time, she smiled. A faint but genuine expression of gratitude. The train slowed, the brakes squealing loudly as it pulled into the station. The young man's breathing quickened, his eyes darting toward the doors as if calculating his chances. Connor's gaze sharpened, his voice cutting through the tension. Don't, he said, his tone carrying a promise of regret. The young man froze, his hands twitching slightly, but he didn't move. The train came to a complete stop. The doors hissed open. A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing toward the exit. Two of them stood and stepped off quickly, their eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the scene entirely. Stay seated, Connor said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes flicked toward a few others who seemed tempted to leave. Everyone stays right where they are. One man hesitated, then slowly sank back into his seat. Another pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll, though his trembling hands betrayed him. Suddenly, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the subway tunnel. They grew louder, their urgency filling the car. The young man's breathing became frantic. His fingers twitched as his muscles tensed, his eyes darting toward the door. Don't even think about it, Connor warned, his voice low and menacing, like a predator issuing a final warning. The young man deflated, his body going limp on the floor. This is stupid, he muttered, his face twisted in frustration. You're acting like you're a cop or something. Connor chuckled darkly, the sound low and humorless. I don't need a badge to know right from wrong. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze cutting through the young man. You, though? You might want to figure that out. The sirens grew louder, and soon the flashing red and blue lights lit up the subway windows. The train began to slow again, the tension in the car reaching its peak. Springfield Junction, the intercom announced. Stand clear of the doors. Connor's eyes stayed locked on the young man as the train came to a stop with a jolt. The doors slid open, letting in a rush of cool air. Silence. Then, heavy footsteps. 4 uniformed officers entered the train, their faces sharp and focused. Their eyes scanned the car and instantly locked onto the man on the floor. The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. What's going on here? Connor didn't flinch. He nodded toward the young man. This one tried to rob that woman, he said, gesturing to the elderly woman who sat a little straighter. Shoved her, snatched her bag, and tried to run. I stopped him. The officers exchanged glances, then one stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. All right, on your feet, he barked. I didn't do anything. The young man protested as the officer grabbed his arm, yanking him to his feet. She dropped it. That's all. Tell it to the judge. the officer snapped, twisting the man's arms behind his back. The sharp click of the cuffs was a sound of finality. Connor stepped back, watching as the officers escorted the young man off the train. The remaining passengers exhaled collectively, the tension finally releasing. The elderly woman wiped away a tear, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you," she said to Connor. He nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching in a faint smile. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The doors hissed shut. The train rumbled forward into the tunnel, leaving the chaos behind. The atmosphere in the subway car shifted the moment the police arrived. The officer at the front moved swiftly, pulling out handcuffs and barking, "On your feet." The young man, still protesting, yanked his arm away. "I didn't do anything," he argued, but the officer grabbed him by the arm, dragging him upright. "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, twisting his arms behind his back with a sharp, final movement. The metallic clink of the handcuffs echoed in the air, a sound of certainty. As the officers pulled him off the train, the passengers collectively exhaled in relief. Some whispered among themselves, the tension finally lifting. The elderly woman wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes locked on Connor. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave her a small nod, his message clear, he didn't need to speak. The train doors slid closed with a hiss, and the rumble of the tracks returned. Connor sat back down, his heart steady, his mind distant. The subway train moved through the tunnels with its usual rhythmic clatter, but the air inside the car was anything but calm. Connor sat near the back, his eyes fixed straight ahead, though his mind was still consumed with what had just unfolded. The woman sat across from him, her hands still clutching her bag like a lifeline. Every so often, her fingers twitched, a sign that the fear hadn't completely left her body. The mood in the car had changed completely. What had once been tense silence now shifted to an uncomfortable stillness, filled with the weight of shame. No one made eye contact. People's gazes were either locked on their phones or out the window, avoiding the reality around them. A few passengers who had laughed at the young man's antics earlier now sat silently, their faces pale, their eyes downcast. Connor observed it all, his gaze flicking from one passenger to the next. The weight of the police presence still hung in the air, even though the officers had already left with the young man. The old woman hadn't spoken since thanking him, her eyes darting nervously, as if waiting for something else to go wrong. He knew that feeling, the one where trouble seems to linger even after the moment has passed. "You okay?" Connor asked, his voice low but steady enough to cut through the stillness. The woman blinked, as if pulled from deep thought. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time since it all began. "I'm fine, baby," she said with a weak smile. "I've been through worse." Her voice was soft but steady, and she adjusted the bag in her lap, patting it gently like a child who needed comforting. "But I appreciate what you did back there. Most folks would have just watched." Connor nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced around at the other passengers. "Yeah, I noticed," he muttered under his breath. "People are real brave until it's time to be." The woman let out a short, dry laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ain't that the truth?" she replied, her gaze lingering on him. She squinted slightly, her head tilting as if trying to figure something out. "You look familiar. I've seen you somewhere before." Connor leaned back and pulled his cap lower over his face. "Just got one of those faces," he said casually, glancing away. She chuckled again, shaking her head. If you say so." Minutes passed in relative quiet, broken only by the grinding sound of metal against metal. The robotic voice of the train's announcement system echoed, calling out the next stop. Connor stayed in his seat, his eyes straight ahead, trying to regain some semblance of peace. Suddenly, a man near the front of the car glanced at him, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Connor ignored him, but he noticed the man reach for his phone. The sound of swiping followed, and a second later the man's face lit up with realization. "Yo," the man muttered, barely above a whisper. His gaze darted between Connor and his phone, the excitement clear in his eyes. "Wait a second, is that Connor Drake?" The words rippled through the car. Heads turned, whispers followed, and people leaned forward, their phones slowly rising. The same passengers who had been silent moments ago were now buzzing with energy. "That's really him," a teenage girl whispered to her friend, pointing at Connor. "Holy, that's Connor Drake." Another man, lowering his headphones, squinted at him. "Is that for real?" he mumbled. Connor sighed, his face hardening. This was the moment he dreaded, the quiet whispers turning into flashing cameras and excited requests. He had been in this situation countless times before. It always began with a whisper, then glances, and before long, phones were out snapping pictures. He gave the man who'd started it all a cold, sharp look. The grin faltered as the man realized his mistake, freezing mid-sentence. Connor didn't speak, but his eyes told the story. He wasn't interested. It was too late. "Yo, Connor," the man called out, holding his phone up, already aiming to take a picture. "Can I get a selfie?" A few others followed suit, their phones up, cameras open. Connor had enough. His eyes flashed with cold authority. "Not today," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated, lowering his phone like a child being scolded. One of the teenage girls, undeterred, snapped a quick picture anyway. The soft click of her phone's camera caught Connor's attention, and his eyes snapped toward her. She froze, her face flushed with embarrassment, quickly lowering her phone. The elderly woman watching the scene unfold couldn't help but smile slightly, her eyes twinkling with recognition. "I knew it," she said softly. "I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." She tilted her head, squinting at him. "Connor Drake, huh? Well, I'll be." Connor glanced at her, finally allowing himself to smile. "Don't blow my cover," he said, tapping the brim of his cap. She chuckled again, shaking her head. "If you say so, baby." Connor Drake shook his head slowly, his piercing gaze slicing through the man holding up his phone. "Not today," he said firmly, his voice steady and calm. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. The man hesitated, the grin fading from his face. He lowered his phone reluctantly, looking more like a reprimanded child than the eager fan he had been moments ago. Connor didn't miss the soft click of a camera behind him. His eyes darted toward a teenage girl who froze as he turned to meet her gaze. She gasped, her face flushing bright red as she quickly lowered her phone. The old woman across from Connor had been watching the entire scene unfold with a bemused smile. Her eyes twinkled with recognition, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but certain. "I knew it," she said, her grin widening. "I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." She sat back with a self-assured nod, like she'd just solved a puzzle that had been bothering her all day. "Connor Drake, huh? Well, I'll be." For the first time since stepping onto the train, Connor allowed himself a small smile. "Don't blow my cover," he said quietly, tipping the brim of his cap. The old woman chuckled, her laughter warm but tinged with exhaustion. "Your secret's safe with me, baby," she said with a wink. The intercom crackled. "Next stop, Midway Junction. Doors will open on the right." The train began to slow, the deceleration pushing passengers slightly forward in their seats. A few people gathered their bags, preparing to get off. Connor kept his eyes on the floor, willing the moment to pass, but he knew better. The whispers hadn't stopped, the glances hadn't stopped, and now the cameras wouldn't stop either. From the back of the car, someone muttered, "Yo, I'm putting this on TikTok." Connor closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Of course they would. It didn't matter what he'd done or why. To them, this wasn't about standing up for someone in need. It was about capturing a moment, a video to share for likes and views. The train screeched to a halt, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. A few passengers stepped off quickly, but not before one man paused long enough to snap a picture of Connor before hopping onto the platform. Connor watched him go, his jaw tightening as his hands gripped the edge of his seat. The old woman leaned forward again, her voice soft but full of wisdom. "Don't mind them, baby," she said gently. "They only see the flash, not the fight." Connor glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. She smiled at him, tilting her head like a grandmother sharing a secret. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "Doesn't matter who sees it." The train doors slid closed, and Connor sat in silence, letting her words sink in. For a moment, he felt lighter, until his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out reluctantly, glancing at the screen. A notification popped up from social media. "You're trending, bro." The headline beneath it read, "Connor Drake stops robbery on subway." He stared at the notification for a long moment before another one came through. "Real-life hero, Connor Drake takes down subway thug. Watch the viral video." Connor let out a frustrated sigh, turning off the screen and sliding the phone back into his pocket. He leaned back, his eyes drifting to the old woman. She was gazing out the window now, her bag safe in her lap and her hands steady. The subway rattled deeper into the tunnel, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. Connor closed his eyes, trying to focus on the hum of the tracks beneath him. No cameras, no flashes, no noise, just the rhythmic sound of the subway moving forward. But he knew it was already too late. Somewhere out there, his face was already on a screen. Somewhere, someone was sharing the story. By the time he reached his stop, the world would be watching. The car jolted slightly, and Connor opened his eyes. The dim light of the carriage cast long shadows, but he could still see the old woman sitting across from him. She wasn't looking at him in awe or with curiosity. Her expression held something deeper, respect, perhaps, or gratitude. At the far end of the car, two teenage boys huddled together, whispering and glancing at their phones. One snickered, tilting the screen toward the other. Connor didn't need to guess what they were watching. His phone buzzed again, then again. He pulled it out slowly, dreading what he'd see. Messages flooded the screen, one after another. "Connor, call me. You're blowing up online. We need to get ahead of this." "Dude, you're a legend for that." Connor shut the phone off and shoved it back into his pocket. He wasn't ready for this. Not now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and letting out a long breath through his nose. The weight on his shoulders didn't feel lighter. If anything, it felt heavier. "Next stop, Sycamore Station. Doors will open on the right," the intercom announced. A woman in the middle of the car stood up, adjusting her coat and grabbing her purse. She glanced at Connor, her eyes lingering a moment longer than necessary. She didn't say anything, but her expression said it all. Recognition was like a chain reaction. One person pointed, another whispered, and before long the entire car knew. Connor's peace was gone, shattered by the very act that made it possible. The murmurs in the subway car grew louder. One of the teenage boys whispered to his friend, his phone held low, but his eyes darting toward Connor. "I swear that's him, bro. That's Drake." His friend glanced over, his eyes widening in realization. "No way," he muttered, his hand already moving toward his phone. Connor noticed it all out of the corner of his eye. His patience was wearing thin, but he kept his cool. He leaned back against his seat, tilting the brim of his cap lower to shield his face. It wouldn't help. It never did. The subway screeched loudly as it slowed, the grinding of metal on metal echoing through the car. The train pulled into Sycamore Station, and the doors slid open, letting in a rush of crisp air. Passengers shuffled out, some sneaking quick glances at Connor as they passed. A man in a gray hoodie paused at the door, staring at Connor like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Connor felt the weight of his gaze. "That's him," the man muttered, pulling out his phone. Connor's jaw tightened, the tension visible in the hard set of his features. The old woman across from him noticed. She sat forward slightly, her eyes sharp and knowing. She didn't say a word, but her gaze alone was enough. The man hesitated, glanced at her, then back at Connor. Reluctantly, he lowered his phone and stepped off the train just as the doors hissed shut. Connor met the old woman's eyes, and she gave him a small nod. He returned it with a faint one of his own. The train lurched forward, sending a ripple through the passengers. The ride continued in an intense, uneasy quiet. Nobody laughed, nobody recorded. But Connor knew better. It wouldn't last. Minutes passed, and his phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He didn't need to look to know what it was. The headlines were already writing themselves in his mind. Connor Drake stops subway robbery, or Drake becomes real-life action hero. The media loved stories like this. They'd blow it up, twist it into something larger than life, turning him into something he wasn't. He wasn't a hero. He'd simply done what anyone should have done. But he also knew that didn't matter. Across from him, the old woman cleared her throat softly. "They're going to turn you into a story, baby," she said, her voice calm but certain. "They always do." Connor glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "They will." "Don't let them change the ending," she added, her eyes steady on his. "It's still your story." Her words hit harder than he expected. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as her advice settled deep in his mind. His story. His ending. The train rolled on, the minutes dragging. The teenage boys were still whispering, still glancing at their phones, but they didn't approach. Connor didn't need to look to know they were snapping pictures, uploading them, and sending them to their friends. By the time he stepped off the train, he knew half the world would already know. He glanced at the old woman one last time. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing steady and calm. She looked at peace, finally able to rest. After everything, she could rest. His phone buzzed again, and his patience snapped. He yanked it out, ready to turn it off for good. But the message at the top of the screen gave him pause. It wasn't from his agent or publicist or some random news outlet. It was a text from his sister. "Proud of you, Con. You did the right thing." Connor stared at the words, simple and raw. He felt his chest tighten, not from stress or anger, but something else. Something real. He slid the phone back into his pocket, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees. For the first time since the incident began, he let himself breathe. The intercom crackled. "Next stop, Southgate Station. Doors will open on the right." Connor sat up straighter. This was his stop. He glanced at the old woman. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing steady. He didn't want to wake her. She'd been through enough. As the train slowed, Connor stood, his hands in his pockets. The old woman stirred slightly, one eye opening as she smiled softly at him. It was a slow, knowing smile, like she understood something he didn't. "Take care, baby," she said quietly. "You too," Connor replied, his voice low but steady. "Stay safe." The train came to a stop, the doors sliding open with a hiss. Cool air filled the car as Connor stepped out, his eyes scanning the platform. No cameras, no crowds. Just people, ordinary people, too caught up in their own lives to notice him. He walked forward with purpose, his head low, his steps steady. Behind him, the train doors shut with a metallic hiss, sealing the world behind him. As he moved down the platform, his phone buzzed again, then again and again. His agent, his publicist, news alerts, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. They all wanted a piece of the story, his story. Connor kept walking, his head down, his pace unbroken. Let the world watch if it wanted to. Let them twist the narrative if they had to. For the first time in a long time, Connor wasn't playing a role. This time, he was just a man who did the right thing. Connor Drake had been standing at the window of his apartment for over 20 minutes, staring at his phone as messages poured in. Notifications stacked up like falling dominoes, each one demanding his attention. His inbox overflowed with texts, missed calls, and social media mentions. His face remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped against the edge of the phone with slow, deliberate rhythm. "Connor, the video has 2 million views already. Call me. We need to get ahead of this. The media is all over it, man. You're a hero. People love you for this." He scrolled through the endless stream of messages, his eyes narrowing. Most were from his agent, his manager, and random acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. The rest were news alerts from every major outlet. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. Connor Drake stops subway robbery. Real-life hero Connor Drake takes down subway thug. Hollywood star becomes symbol of courage in viral video. Connor rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling a slow, heavy sigh. They weren't even telling the story right. They never did. It wasn't supposed to be about him. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about the woman, the one nobody helped until it was nearly too late. But that wasn't the story people wanted to hear. No, they wanted Connor Drake, the action star, swooping in like it was one of his movies. He tossed the phone onto the table and sank onto the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The weight of it all sat heavy on his shoulders, like a lead blanket. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted it. His whole goal that day was to be invisible, just another face in the crowd. Now the world was watching. A knock echoed through the apartment, sharp and loud. Connor turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the door. The knock came again, more urgent this time. "Connor, it's me, Ethan," a familiar voice called from the other side. "Open up, man. I know you're in there." Connor hesitated, then stood and walked to the door. He unlocked it and opened it to reveal Ethan, his longtime friend and sometimes bodyguard. Ethan stepped inside quickly, glancing around like they might be followed. His phone was in his hand and his face was tight with concern. "Man, you're all over the news," Ethan said, shaking his head. "It's everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. You're viral, bro." "I know," Connor muttered, walking back to the couch. He sat down and rubbed his temples. "I don't need to see it to know. My phone won't stop buzzing." Ethan sat beside him, scrolling on his phone as he talked. They're calling you a hero, Con. People love you for this. They're saying you stood up when nobody else did. You know how rare that is? Connor let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, well, they weren't on that train. They didn't see how long it took for someone to do something. He shook his head, his eyes distant. Half of them were recording. The other half were laughing. Nobody moved until it was almost too late. It doesn't matter now, Ethan said, his tone firm as he put his phone down. What matters is they saw you do it. That's all people care about. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on Connor's. They're talking about interviews, late-night shows, morning news, the works. Everyone wants to hear your side of the story. You've got to control the narrative before they do it for you. Connor leaned back, resting his head against the cushion. His eyes focused on the ceiling, his jaw tightening. No? Ethan frowned. No? What do you mean, no? I mean, no, Connor repeated, turning his head toward him. I'm not doing interviews. I'm not sitting on TV telling people how brave I was. I'm not interested. Come on, man, Ethan said, leaning forward. You know how this works. If you stay quiet, they'll fill in the blanks for you. They'll twist it, turn it into something it's not. Another hero saves the day story, and you'll have no control over it. Connor stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly what they'll do. So what's the plan? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. You just going to let it ride? Connor sat up straight, leaning his forearms on his knees. He thought about the old woman on the subway, her eyes, her voice, the way she clutched her bag like it was the only thing she had left. Her words echoed in his mind. Don't let them change the ending. He nodded to himself, his eyes sharp with new focus. No, he said, standing up. I'm going to tell it myself. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. Oh yeah? How are you going to do that? Connor grabbed his phone off the table, unlocked it, and opened the camera app. He sat on the edge of the couch, holding the phone up so his face filled the frame. No lights, no angles, just him, raw and unfiltered. Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms with a small smirk. All right, let's see this. Connor muttered to himself, taking a breath. Then he hit the record button. He stared directly into the camera, his face calm but firm. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set like stone. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. By now, you've probably seen the video, he began, his tone steady and deliberate. Connor Drake leaned into the camera, his tone sharp, his gaze steady. I know what they're saying. They're calling me a hero, saying I did something special. But I'm here to tell you, that's not the story. He paused, letting his words linger. His eyes didn't waver from the lens, his presence unflinching. The story isn't about me. It's about the woman on that train. An elderly woman, minding her own business, getting harassed, shoved, and disrespected. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't the guy doing it. It was the fact that nobody did anything. They watched. They laughed. They recorded it like it was some kind of entertainment. Connor leaned forward, his voice lowering but growing more intense. That's the real story. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. People saw something wrong, and they looked away. They pulled out their phones instead of their courage. He sat back slightly, but kept his eyes locked on the camera. If you're watching this, I want you to ask yourself one thing. What would you have done? Would you have helped, or would you have watched? The silence that followed was deliberate. He let it stretch, the weight of his question hanging in the air. Don't call me a hero, he said finally. I'm just a man who did what needed to be done. But next time, it might be you sitting on that train. It might be you holding that phone. Ask yourself if you're going to watch or if you're going to act. Connor ended the recording and placed his phone on the table. Ethan, sitting across from him, exhaled deeply, his voice low with respect. Man, that's it. That's the one. Connor didn't reply. He uploaded the video without captions, without hashtags, just the raw truth. Less than a minute later, his phone began buzzing. Comments poured in. Shares multiplied. This is what we need to hear. Finally, someone said it. Nah, he's right. I'm ashamed of myself now. Connor turned the phone face down on the table and leaned back. His eyes were distant but steady. This time, it wasn't about him. This time, the story would be different. He glanced at Ethan, then out the window where the city lights flickered like stars. Sometimes, Connor murmured, his voice quiet but firm, you've got to change the ending yourself. The next morning, Connor woke to the relentless buzzing of his phone. It vibrated loudly on the nightstand, refusing to be ignored. Sunlight filtered through the blackout curtains, streaking gold across the room. Rubbing his eyes, Connor sat up, groggy from a restless night. Slowly, he reached for his phone, blinking against the glow of the screen. 56 missed calls. Over 300 messages. Every social media app flooded with notifications stacked like bricks. His face was on every thumbnail, his name in every headline. Connor Drake stops subway robbery. Don't watch, act. Hollywood star goes viral for real-life heroism. He scrolled through the messages, each one arriving faster than he could read. You're a legend for that video, Connor. Respect. We need more people like you in this world. Can you come on our show this week? We'd love to have you talk about your experience. Connor let the phone drop onto the bed beside him, shaking his head. They weren't even listening. The story had grown beyond him, beyond the woman on that train. Now it was a movement. People shared their own stories in the comments. Some admitted to moments when they'd stayed quiet, regretting it later. Others recounted times they had stepped in and done the right thing. The hashtag #Don'tWatchAct trended worldwide. It wasn't just a phrase, it had become a call to action. Connor leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. For a long time he sat in silence, replaying the events of the past 24 hours. The subway, the old woman, the young man face down on the floor. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call from his sister. Connor sighed but answered, holding the phone up to his face. His sister's face appeared on the screen, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. "Look at you, big bro, out here saving the world," she teased, her smile exaggerated. "You know you broke the internet, right?" Connor rolled his eyes and leaned back against the headboard. "Don't start with me, Tasha. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Supposed to be like what?" she asked, her grin softening. "You stood up for that woman. People saw it, you inspired them. Ain't nothing wrong with that." "I didn't do it to inspire anybody," Connor muttered, running a hand over his face. "I did it because nobody else would." Olivia's face softened even further. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know, but that's exactly why it's hitting so hard, Con. You didn't have to do it, but you did. People see that, and it makes them think, makes them wonder if they'd have done the same." Connor didn't respond. She was right, of course. He just hadn't wanted any of this attention. He'd wanted to stay in the shadows, to remain invisible. But shadows don't stay hidden when the world puts a spotlight on you. Shadows don't exist when the world puts a spotlight on you. Olivia continued, smirking knowingly. "Anyway, I just called to tell you. Mom saw it. She called me all choked up, saying how proud she is of you." Tasha grinned wider, leaning closer to the camera. "She told me to say, tell Connor he finally did something worth talking about." Connor chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that sounds like her." "You good, though?" Olivia asked, her teasing tone fading as her eyes narrowed with concern. "For real, Con, all jokes aside, you good?" He paused, letting the question settle. His gaze flicked to his phone, still lighting up on the bed with endless notifications. The world was knocking on his door, but for once, he didn't feel like running. "Yeah," he said quietly, nodding. "I'm good." "All right," Olivia replied, her grin returning. "Stay solid, big bro. I'll call you later." "Yeah," he replied, ending the call. Connor stared at the phone for a moment longer, before slowly standing and heading to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool drink steadying his nerves as he leaned against the counter. His thoughts drifted back to the old woman on the train, her face, her eyes, and how they had shifted from fear to gratitude. Another buzz from his phone pulled him back to the present. This time, it was a notification from a news outlet. New developments in subway assault, police release statement. Connor raised an eyebrow and tapped the alert, opening the article. The headline read, "Suspect in subway incident faces multiple charges, including assault and robbery." He scrolled through the text. The article detailed how security footage from the subway's cameras, along with witness statements, had confirmed everything Connor had described. It wasn't just his word anymore. The system had seen it too. Near the bottom of the article, there was a quote from the elderly woman. Her name was listed as Jada Harper, 72, retired nurse. Her words hit Connor harder than any headline ever could. "I was scared. I thought nobody would help me. But then he did." He didn't do it for fame or attention. He did it because it was right. People need to remember that sometimes you just have to do what's right. Connor stared at the screen, feeling something shift inside him, something steady and unshakable. He placed the phone face down on the counter and looked at his reflection in the kitchen window. His face looked tired but sure. He walked back to the living room, picked up his phone, and opened the camera app. No lights, no scripts, no dramatic setup, just him, raw and unfiltered. Hitting record, he stared into the lens, calm but resolute. "By now, you've all seen the video," he began, his voice steady. "And you've probably seen the headlines. They're calling me a hero, again." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "I'm not. I'm just a man who saw something wrong and did something about it. That's all." His tone grew firmer, his jaw tightening with purpose. "But this isn't about me. It never was. It's about her. Her name is Jada Harper. She's 72 years old. She's a retired nurse. She's somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. She didn't deserve what happened to her. None of it." Connor leaned forward, his eyes piercing the camera. "This isn't about being a hero. It's about what you do when you see something wrong. Do you sit there and watch it happen? Or do you stand up? Do you do something?" He let the question hang in the air, the silence deliberate and heavy. With a small nod, he finished with one final sentence. "Next time you see it, don't watch, do." Connor ended the recording and uploaded it. No captions, no hashtags, just truth. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Comments flooded in. People shared it alongside their own stories. Parents showed it to their kids. Schools played it during assemblies. The hashtag #Don'tWatchDo trended worldwide in less than an hour. Connor sat back on the couch, closing his eyes. His phone buzzed nonstop, but this time, he didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt at ease. The story wasn't about him. It was about her. About what people should do when they see injustice. He leaned his head back, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside his window. The world would always be loud, always watching, but he didn't feel the need to run from it anymore. This time, he had changed the ending. And this time, the story was exactly what it needed to be.